Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining this HARP session. My name is Nahielly Palacios. I'm a lecturer in education at the University of Manchester, and I will be facilitating this session.
Without further ado, let's begin the session. Today's topic is Into the Unknown, Vulnerability and Connection in Active Fieldwork. Through this topic, panelists will acknowledge the vulnerability and emotions involved in the active phase of conducting research. Let's meet our panel. First joining us is Dr. Jing Wang, SID alumni at the University of Manchester. Next, we have Zhuoran You, PhD researcher at the university. Also joining us live, Dr. Josef Ploner, senior lecturer in education at the University of Manchester. And finally, Dr. Xian Zhao, SID alumna of the University of Manchester. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite Dr. Jing Wang to share her experience with the topic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jing. Thank you so much, Nahielly, for having me today. And this is a really interesting topic. I feel really excited to share my story today, actually. I want to share today is how I dealt with a moment of vulnerability of my participants and how that encounter further shaped my understanding of narrative research and my role as a narrative researcher. Okay, it's moving good. Okay, so firstly, I would like to talk a little bit more about the expected before we get into unexpected. By expected, I mean the knowledge that I brought into this narrative session. And so firstly, the knowledge, the nature of narrative inquiry, which I got from reading and also conducting my pilot study and also previous sessions with my participants. Before this encounter, I was well aware that narrative inquiry is situated, co-constructed, and flexible. So situated means, for instance, if your participants shares a story in a coffee shop, it might be different from when they share this story, the same story in a library. And the co-constructed, it means that the presence of the researcher might shape the content and the style of the sharing. And flexibility, my understanding is how it emphasizes the autonomy of your participants. So it requires lots of flexibility from the researcher's end. And secondly, my knowledge of the participants. It was something that I'd been trying to do throughout this project. So very early on during the recruitment, I would have small chats with my participants just to get to know them a little bit better, to provide this safe space and comfortable space for them to share. So at that point, I had a solid understanding of their age, their background, and their personality, and I had heard a lot of their personal intercultural experiences from their previous sessions. And I built very strong connections with them over time because of the longitudinal nature of my study. I conducted narrative sessions at the beginning, middle, and end of their study. And in between the sessions, I would check in with them occasionally and to say how they were doing and if they were happy with the transcription and if there was any part they would like to be taken out. Also, I maintained a very clear communication with my participants. I expressed my research interests very clearly, even in the recruitment. For instance, I had a very clear statement of the purpose of my project in recruitment. So I keep my participants well informed and well updated of my decisions at each stage. And this unexpected incident happened during a session with Grace, one of my participants. So this happened just shortly after her breakup, which was a very unfortunate timing. Like the first 20 and 30 minutes of the session was perfectly normal because she focused a lot on my research question. However, at some point, she just decided to share more about her past relationship and her ex, and this decision in turn shaped the rest of the interview. How I reacted to this unexpected incident is that there were two parts of me communicating with each other and jointly making this decision. So emotionally, I felt really torn. I really felt for her, and I appreciate how hard it was for her to still participate in this session and how hurt she was. And I completely understood why she would like to share the stories with me, because she needed someone to talk to and she needed this safe space as well. However, rationally, I was really aware that the sharing was not really relevant to my research question. That means I had a decision to make. I had to decide whether it was more important for me to show up as a supportive friend or a normal human being who could share and resonate with her emotions and feelings, or was it more important for me to stay an intentional researcher who stayed focused on her research interest? And not only that, I had to think about what I should do on the spot and how might my decisions further shape the rest of the session, her future participation, and our future relationship. After having this really quick chat with myself, I decided to give her the time and the space to share her past relationship, and because I believe it was the right and ethical thing to do. So what did I do in more detail was that I accounted for her emotions and feelings before proceeding with this private conversation. I paused the audio recording to create this more personal space for her. And I listened very attentively, very actively to her sharing, even though it wasn't relevant to my research question or interest. Secondly, I offered her as much emotional support as I could, and I responded to her sharing attentively but very cautiously, because I was aware she was really deep in her emotions and it wasn't really my place to comment on her decisions or her feelings. And lastly, I kept a mental note of the time and the research question, because my decision was at some point I needed to go back to my research question and to stay within the research agenda. And as time passed by, I became increasingly aware of the time she spent on sharing her past relationship. Um, so I was thinking to myself, oh, maybe it was the time to actually gently remind her of the interview agenda. And before I even did it, there was a very interesting turn. So Grace herself started to comment on her attitude towards interacting with people from different national backgrounds. So she went back to the research agenda herself. I was really impressed by the richness and openness in her sharing. And for the rest of the session, and also that went beyond the session, because in the end, towards the end, she actually requested an extra session for her last round. So I got really rich and interesting data from her. And this very unexpected and specific encounter with her encouraged me to reflect on my role as a narrative researcher and what it means to be doing narrative research. And here are the three main takeaways I got from that encounter. So firstly, as a narrative researcher, we have this duty of care to our participants, and narrative sessions should always be a safe and comfortable space where your participants feel comfortable and safe sharing their emotions and feelings without the fear of being judged, and they should feel seen, heard, and well supported. And the duty of nature goes hand in hand with the situatedness and co-constructedness of narrative inquiry, because as a narrative researcher, you don't really know what to expect from one narrative session. And so very often you have to make a decision on the spot to act on the best of your participants' interest. And the second point is flexibility in narrative research agenda. And to what extent is flexibility acceptable, and to what extent it becomes excessive? And I was still thinking before this presentation, so if Greece kept going on, was it ethical to disrupt her at the right time? If so, when is the right time to disrupt? And how to handle vulnerability in a respectful way, especially when your participants are vulnerable themselves at the moment, how to stay focused on your research agenda without adding more layers of harm to their very vulnerable state. And the last one is it encourages me to reflect on the connection involved in narrative research. Now I see storytelling as a way to build connections. Okay, that's the main point I want to share for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jing, for sharing your story. I found it very interesting. So I felt like a powerful, reflection of how care, ethics, and connection can shape the narrative research that you were doing, but also, of course, shape yourself as a narrative researcher. So thank you for sharing that. Shall we move on to the next story? Zhuoran, are you ready to share your story?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So a connection that is unexpected was happening actually between me and another researcher from St. Andrews, University of St. Andrews. It was not during fieldwork, but in my daily life. I want to share it because it was so unexpected. I was actually interested in one of her handbags, which is a light luxury brand, because I think it's not necessary to buy it, to pay for it with a brand new price. So we add each other on WeChat for further communication, and during that casual conversations, we realized that we actually share the same research directions. We all focus on digital education, but what is more fascinating is that she actually focused more on computer science because she had a bachelor degree in this direction, but I focused more on the pedagogical theories. We make perfect complement. So by that time, she proposed to co-author a paper, and we have done a literature review up to now. That is really surprising. I want to share the experiences is because, ironically, I haven't done any useful or say effective networking during any formal academic research events. Well, I think the reason behind might be that for new researchers, we are really hesitant to present ourselves during the formal event because we're afraid to be criticized, and there are so many researchers that is full of experiences. We sometimes feel ashamed, so we cannot feel relaxed in a formal research event. So quite the opposite. In daily lives, we just chat with our friends and know some people from nowhere, and we are more happy to share our experiences and research topic with them because we know they won't judge. So what I want to say is that please be open to any potential chances to interact with others because I believe it will definitely surprise you. So that is a very, very unexpected connection I established with another researcher. So about the unexpected isolation, which is exactly happening during my field work, I assume that many researchers might encounter the same difficulties with me, is about an isolation between you and the subject you are doing studies. So, for example, like as my supervisors and I assumed, we think that most of the potential participants might give us informed consent after I introduce my research. But after several rounds of introduction, I only get 36 informed consents out of 150 students in total. So this made me realize that our participants can never pretend we do not exist, even though we promise them that we are just observing them, we do not judge, but they will not buy it anyway. Before, it is interesting because before this real experiences, I took it for granted that as long as I introduce them, detailed enough, vivid enough, they will believe me that I am just an observer. But the fact just says no to me. So even though we clarified hundreds of times that we're gonna do that, all gonna do is just watch and to observe, but they will not believe it. So I mean, it's understandable. If we stand in their shoes, for example, a department leader just jumps out and from nowhere and says she will just watch how you're going to teach and research, they will not judge, they will not mark you, but we will still feel uncomfortable, right? So in that case, I think the isolation between researchers and potential participants does and will always exist. And no matter how active your participants seem to be. So that's a disappointing fact we have to live with. And this led to two results. The first is that I had to rely on secondary data sets that were generously offered by my supervisor to build the collaborative learning patterns for my research project. So, and another result is that when I got to interview those who gave me informed consent, I have to be really careful and I have to protect their privacy and feelings and try my best to get as much as I can within this small and limited sample size. So for participants can be way more vulnerable than we thought. Even those consented participants can be really defensive during the interviews. That's one case I have encountered with. She seemed to be really active and interested in my research project, but it turns out that I can tell that she actually held something away from me and being super defensive, and I am trying to ask her question in a strategic way. So I think as researchers, we should think more in shoes of our participants that can better address the isolation between us and our participants. So that's my story. I hope it can be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these two stories. I think it surprised me. It doesn't surprise me really, that first story of that unexpected connection, because you're a very friendly person, you're very approachable, and I'm sure you get to meet a lot of people. But I think it's a change of scenery, isn't it? Different setting, and you get to meet people, and then suddenly you realize, oh, we're interested in the same things. And we're doing research. Oh, and you get together, and that's amazing. That's a really nice way of being, open to collaboratively working with other people. And about the second story, what makes me think is, that again, unexpected events that happened, and how you handle the situation, how you had to navigate the situation to just make sure that your research plan, although it might change, you do the different actions to get back or redirect you to probably unanticipated but meaningful ways of addressing your research. So that was very, very interesting to hear. To continue our conversation, I'd like to invite Dr. Josef Ploner to share his experience with the topic. Over to you, Josef.
Hi, thanks Nahielly, thanks Zhuoran and Ying. It's very nice to be here. It's a fantastic platform, as I said earlier. It's really good to share also my experience as a researcher. And I've been, I'm an education researcher. My interest is really researching international students and their experiences. My background is actually as an anthropologist. I'm used to fieldwork, and like my pre-speakers, I'm also into qualitative research. I like narrative approaches. And I want to tell a couple of stories maybe, which lessons I've learned in the past, which reflects to the vulnerability of both the researcher and the participants as well. I started out really as an anthropologist of tourism and tourism leisure mobilities, and I was interested in the relationship between heritage and tourism conflicts. And I think it was one of my first experience, and reminded me when Jing said, you have interview participants who just talk too much and they take control of the interview and things. And my issue back then, and I was still a fairly young early career researcher, was I happened to interview a lot of experts and so-called experts and policymakers. And I quickly learned they just they talk you down, and as everybody knows, they take the very quickly control of an interview, and that's really a moment I felt really vulnerable as an early career, exactly as my PhD was on stake. You have high hopes of getting something out, and you felt, really being controlled rather than in control. I quickly learned to turn the wheel and to do it differently and to learn from that, and thankfully that worked as well. There were other moments in my career, I think, where because I'm interested in, coming from tourism, I really was interested in mobilities of international students as well, and not only kind of leisure mobilities, but also very difficult mobilities. So I worked on projects linked to the concept of resilience and academic hospitality. And in the context of these projects, I've worked a lot with international students who come from so-called, less privileged backgrounds and often very difficult backgrounds. So I was really interviewing students who had migration experience, forced migration, labor migration experiences, who came from all parts of the world, also which are riddled by conflict, the Middle East included, but African countries and so forth. So this was a really eye-opener for me. And again, the topic was resilience. It was really the core of the research was, how do students who go through a lot in their lives actually manage to succeed, to persevere, to achieve, to use education as a pathway of achievement and get in terms with their own lives, but also, work on their aspirations. And that was really a really intense moment, because it was a difficult process interviewing those people. So you had the refugee from Syria who experienced torture, when he was, we had a young lady, a mature student from Congo, I think it was, who had to flee her country with her two young children. And her husband left her, and shouldn't probably, it's all anonymized, but these are some of the stories you encounter. And even reaching the UK, she experienced racism and discrimination in her neighborhood, really badly abused. And a lot of those kind of stories, people losing friends, relatives, all sorts of so-called resilient biographies. And the interesting thing, though, was, again, I wasn't prepared. Going back to Ying's point, can you prepare for such instances? I don't think you can. You cannot. We have a lot of ethics mechanisms now to deal with those things. A kind of debrief tools, as well as kind of emergency exits. If you get into uncomfortable situations like that, a distress policy, I think it's called, and I think these are useful to a point, but I think once you're in a room with somebody, it's difficult to make use of those policy and distress documents and so forth. I think you have to be very clear from the start, that this is a sensitive topic. And my behavior, and again, letting them talk. I'm a big fan of biographical interviewing, not least because research on international students mainly very often sees them in a bubble, when they enter university and when they leave again university. But I like to see their whole life, really, which tells us a lot more about their aspirations, their personalities, and their life trajectories. And I think listening is a key thing. What Ying said about also the same point of somebody else taking over the control of an interview. In this case, it's actually a good thing sometimes, because you get to hear stories. And yes, maybe not everything is relevant to your research questions and your objectives, but and they may be later on when you visit or revisit the data. But in many ways they are, they are a form of icebreaker, not only at the beginning, but throughout the interview. I think it's, of course, being human, being understanding, even you cannot imagine or a pain of another person in such a context. These are some of the lessons I learned also very quickly there, that it actually, and it was super exciting and super interesting, and also showing a lot of gratitude, I think, to the researchers or to the interview participants to actually share and be open about it. I think to emphasize that point, in a way, being grateful for them to share it and appreciating them. I think it's very important to repeat that really in the interview and thereafter and before that, One interesting thing, though, that I felt happened with those projects with really vulnerable participants was actually that it had quite a therapeutic effect to them. Because we did a lot of debriefing after the interviews and the research projects, and we had a great positive feedback. So because many told us they had never the chance to tell anybody. They never had the chance to be open about it, especially on university. Yes, they have friends, they have family, they share kind of these very personal stories. But sharing it with somebody kind of official from university who actually listens, even in a research context, was a different thing to that. So they really appreciated that opportunity and were quite open about it in their narrative too. So, and the word therapeutic was used quite a lot of time. So really to help them cope with things experienced in the past. So yeah, I think that was really a key moment for me. Appreciating in a way the method also of biographical interviewing and touching on things which are uncomfortable. I think ethics nowadays is important and it's great. I think it's fantastically handled here at the university, but it has its limits also in terms of what we can do, I think, what we're allowed to do. Again, I'm an anthropologist. I struggle often with field work, which can be overwhelming, sometimes underwhelming, which is unexpected, And again, you cannot always stick to protocol in a way, to be honest, as well. So yeah, I think these are some of the points I would like to share, linking to my research. And yeah, I hope there's something there we can discuss later, perhaps.
Thank you for sharing these stories, because they powerfully highlight how vulnerability is shared between researcher and participant. They often reveal, to the researcher, that relational and unpredictable human encounter, especially as an anthropologist, you're working with people. So they have their lives, you have their lives. There's going to be a moment of connection, of being vulnerable. And as they show how moments of discomfort, loss, grieving, or loss of control can become, important sites of reflexivity, learning, and I think ethical growth as a researcher. Because as you said, Joseph, sometimes, there's a protocol, but sometimes you need to think on the spot and do what's best for your participant. And if that is pausing and listening, pausing the recording and listening and have to provide them with that moment for time and space, then, that's what it needs to be done. But thank you very much all for sharing. I'm going to share now the slides that I have from Xian.
Hello everyone, my name is Xian. I have completed my PhD studies at the University of Manchester last year. Nahielly was one of my PhD supervisors, and I'm very glad to be invited to share one of my stories about PhD research. Because I can't attend the live session, so I have pre-recorded this. So what I would like to share is a story about my experience of disseminating my PhD studies, and I specifically reflect on attending an academic conference. Before the presentation, I spent a lot of time preparing for the slides and rehearsing the content to become very familiar with the content I was going to share. I also expected audience reaction and discussions around my PhD research topic. What I was looking for from attending this academic conference, I think, was very similar to most PhD researchers at the very early stage of their PhD journey, which is a type of validation and recognition from other people in the field. And I linked successful presentation with a type of audience engagement. For example, if more people ask me question, maybe that means my presentation was successful. This was the kind of expectations and emotions I experienced before the conference presentation. About my presentation topic, I shared the experiences of waiting among international students in a UK university. And during my presentation, I was quite anxious and nervous. After all, it was my first international conference. And I tried to look confident, and still I got stuck from time to time, forgetting what to say next. After my presentation, no one asked questions immediately, and the discussion also felt quiet. So, based on these reactions from the session, what I felt was I felt quite isolated, and the silence after my presentation was quite uncomfortable. Also, I felt emotionally exhausted. I prepared and I spent time working on this, and then I had so much expectations, but the reality was quite different. I replayed the interactions mentally multiple times to try to find what went wrong. I also began to question, does my research matter even? Or did I just present it very poorly? And did my research topic fail to connect with other people? So it means maybe my research is not relevant and less significant. And even worse, I was thinking, should I just change my research topic? And another question was, maybe I should just skip the conference dinner later out of shame to avoid everyone. So what happened that quite changed my perception was at the conference dinner I went after all, and someone approached me, a more established person in academia. She came to talk to me because she was the first one to communicate with me after the conference. So I shared what I felt, and then she said, it's actually brave enough to be sharing your research as a PhD student, so don't over criticize yourself, which made me feel quite motivated and encouraged. And the second thing that happened was the next day of the conference. During conference lunch, I spoke with several people individually to continue the conversation. And several people, they asked why I choose to research waiting among international students, and I shared my research motivations and my own experience related to waiting academia and migration contexts. They also recommended some literature and offered some new ways of thinking about my research topic. So this type of interactions were quite informal and also very quiet. It wasn't in a very formal public conference setting, but still it was very meaningful for me. And in summary, the connections with other people occurred to me differently, very differently from what I expected. So, reflecting on this research dissemination activity, I think what I realized is that this experience shifted my understanding of academic engagement. which is that a meaningful connection is not always immediate or visible, and some research resonates slowly or privately or unpredictably with other people. And academic engagement does not always a formal presentation spaces. And this experience also made me rethink what is then the successful research dissemination. So from this presentation, what I think could be useful is that we can recognize that research dissemination is also emotional work. You invest in time, invest in expectations, or the emotional types of work, and the feelings of isolation, doubt, or uncertainty also can happen during the process of presenting and interacting with other people. And the silence or limited immediate engagement may not necessarily indicate a lack of impact. Your research still matters. And the meaningful academic connections may emerge slowly, informally, and unpredictably. And the informal conversations outside formal presentation spaces can become important sites of intellectual exchange and support as well. So these are what I wanted to share for this session, and I hope some of the contents could be useful for you. Thank you.
As we bring the session to a close, I want to express my deep gratitude to the HARP panelists for sharing their stories. As we've heard today, research rarely unfolds in a straight or predictable way. Across these stories, what comes through so strongly is how moments of uncertainty, disruption, vulnerability, and unexpected connection can all become part of the research journey itself. Taken together, these reflections remind us that doing research is not simply about producing knowledge, it is also about learning how to navigate complexity, respond with care, and remain attentive to what emerges along the way. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.